All right, so you got these cute little foxes, fennec foxes. So why do they look like this? What's the most noticeable trait they have? Big ears. So when we look at any organism, really, any population, any species, we look at its traits, its characteristics. What we can always think is, well, why are these traits present? How is this helpful? How is this an asset to this species? Because that's how evolution works. That organisms, species, populations become better adapted to their environment over a period of time. So what do you think? What are some reasons for these huge ears? Jordan?
I've seen foxes, they're little, and maybe they use their giant ears so that they can hear incoming predators.
Okay. Yeah, they're probably a tasty little treat for predators. How many people were thinking something like that for hearing better? That's maybe one of their functions. They have other functions as well. Any other ideas? So besides hearing predators, besides hearing at all, are there any other ideas? Okay, that's a good idea. JT said to make themselves look bigger. There are lots of species that do try to make themselves look larger, more intimidating in the face of predators. Good idea. Any other ideas? Anyone know where these live? North Africa. Good observation, Joe. Yeah, they live in they live in the desert, warm areas. Got another idea, Jordan? They could be, and they are. Large ears like this help them also to dissipate heat, right? Because organisms can, heat can escape through circulation to these exposed parts. And so a large part of probably why their ears are like this is to help them regulate their heat. When their body temperature is rising, they could send more blood out to the extremities to dissipate that heat. We do the same thing, actually. If our body temperature is rising, how do you look? What does your skin look like? We get red. That's because our bodies are shuttling more blood out to our skin where we can more easily dissipate some of that heat to try to cool our bodies down. All right. So let's start with some basics of evolution here today. So as you all sort of told me in our question today, evolution is change in a species or a population over a period of time. But the key point to remember and to not make this misconception is that populations evolve, not individuals. Individual organisms can't change, right? They have certain DNA, certain genes, certain traits that they were born with. And that's all. They're never going to change those traits. It's the species as a whole. When we look at overall this population and the traits that are present, that can change over time as organisms live or die based on natural variations that they might have. So in science, when we use the word theory, it sort of means something different than it means in like maybe English class. Or often when we hear the word theory, we think, well, it's just like an idea, like a possibility. You know, if you have a theory about something, it's kind of like your guess. But in science, a theory is a principle that's been established over a period of time, that has been shown to be supported through lots of experiments, through lots of scientific evidence. A theory is like the highest level of confidence, really, that we have in science. Now, nothing in science is ever unchallengeable. We could always do experiments to try to challenge theories, the theory of gravity or the heliocentric view of the solar system or the theory of evolution or the theory of relativity. They're always open for challenge, but they haven't been ever shown to not be supported by evidence. And so that's what we mean when we say scientific theory, that it's well established, accepted by scientists because it's been confirmed many times. Now, Darwin and Wallace weren't new in what they said about species changing, right? Even as far back as ancient Greece, people, philosophers have said that maybe one species changes into another over time. Do you guys not have this? It's all right. This is just kind of background, just interesting. Um, Aristotle, you may have heard of, ancient Greek philosopher, showed sort of this chain of being with one species over another in this sort of hierarchy, and he put humans at the top. In China, Taoism proposed the idea that species aren't fixed and unchanging, but that they are changeable over time. In ancient Rome, okay, philosophers talked about the earth and the species as being the product of natural principles and not necessarily from divine intervention. In the Middle Ages is when the ideas of special creation started to become accepted in Christian societies, that God created each individual species that you could find anywhere on earth and they would never change. God would create them perfect from the initial beginning, and there would be no reason for them to change. There would be no reason for them to become extinct over time. God created them perfectly. And that held on in Christian societies for a long time. In Islamic societies, there were other ideas about that are more closely related to species being able to change over time. So it varied throughout the world. But then in the Renaissance and Enlightenment, when science started to really become a view of the world, is when lots of these ideas started to change. Right? Still, most people still believed in this special creation, that all species were fixed. They never changed in the history of the earth. Most people believed at that time the earth was only 6,000 years old, because people traced back through looking at the Bible how many generations there had been, and they came up with this number of 6,000 years is when the earth was created. People started to challenge that over time. In the 18th century, scientists started to say, well, maybe these forms evolved from previous forms. You know, when we look at lions and cats, they share a common ancestor. This is what Buffon said, a French naturalist. And then in the 19th century, geologists started to challenge the age of the earth. They looked at the earth and said, well, what we see in the geologic record, it could never have changed this amount in just 6,000 years. They started to analyze the types of rocks that were found and started to push the date of the earth back much, much farther. Other scientists started looking at evolution. Lamarck had these ideas that species change over time. But Lamarck believed that things that happen in a species' lifetime could be inherited in the next generation. That was obviously incorrect. Now, if a couple goes to the gym all the time and works out and become jacked, do they have a little muscle baby? No, obviously, because they're not changing their genetics when they go to the gym and work out. Okay? Lamarck did this crazy experiment. No, it wasn't Lamarck. To challenge Lamarck's idea, another scientist took mice and chopped off their tails and bred them together, and took the baby mice, chopped off their tails, and did this many generations. And if Lamarck's ideas were correct, the mice should have had shorter and shorter tails over the generations. Obviously, that's not what happened. Their tail length didn't change. Then we get to Darwin. Okay, and Wallace. So Darwin and Wallace weren't new in saying species change. It was controversial, but other people had said that in the past. What they did was that they explained how that could happen. That was really their contribution, this idea of natural selection. Um, so both Darwin and Wallace in late 1850s proposed this idea that species change over time through the process of natural selection. And that's how. So evolution says species can change over time. Natural selection says here's how it happens. Here's how a species can evolve from one form to another. So you saw a bunch about Darwin's journey on the Beagle. Darwin was just sort of going for a ride for a couple years. That's what he thought. He was hanging out with the ship's captain, collecting fossils, taking notes, collecting animals, just sort of observing everything as they made their way around the world. Again, it took 5 years to make this entire journey. And so he was able to see lots of different variation. Very few people would have seen that many different places and observed the organisms you find in all these different places. He did eventually publish once, like you saw, once Wallace said, hey, I have these ideas. Darwin's like, oh man, those are my ideas. Should have published this before. But he published his ideas. The famous book that he wrote was on the origin of the species. Became very popular. It was controversial. Darwin was right that many people did not agree with what the principles of natural selection were doing in challenging special creation. But Darwin provided evidence. His Origin of Species, big, thick book, I have a copy, I'll show you, but where he detailed all of the things we saw, looking at all of these different species, he detailed many types of evidence supporting natural selection. And since then, lots of other types of evidence have shown that evolution through natural selection is the best theory of how species change over time. So the one thing Darwin could find at that time and other scientists are fossils. Fossils are a great type of evidence that shows species changing over time. when we look at the fossil record, we know that 99% of species that have ever existed on Earth are extinct now. Most species that have ever been present on Earth, they're now extinct. We're only seeing about 1% of species that are alive today. And when scientists look at these fossils, what they're looking for is sort of the steps that show a species going from one form to another. And sometimes those steps are confusing. Sometimes the fossils in between are not there. One great example of the fossils that are there are with horses. Horses that lived, 20 million years ago were small dog-like creatures. And scientists have found the fossils in between these horses from millions of years ago to modern horses. And what they find is over time, their toes gradually condensed from 4 toes to 3 to 2 to 1 hoof. Their size increased over time. Their teeth changed over time. And we can see sort of the little steps in between that allowed horses to go into their modern form. And so those fossils provided evidence that, hey, horses changed. Horses went from this version to this version. Here's how they changed. We also now have, in geology, ways of accurately determining the age of the Earth through radioactive dating, which you probably studied at Earth Science. We can look at these elements that are found in the rocks and determine exactly how old the Earth is, and it's about 4.6 billion years old. I guess we'll move on with the rest of our evidence tomorrow, but that's probably good for right now.